Fantastic. Good afternoon, everyone. I think we've got a few people joining on time. Actually, we're a minute late. We're just waiting for one other panelist who's gone MIA and a few more attendees, and then we'll get started very soon. That number's going up very rapidly, so we'll make a prompt start so we have a nice slick session this hour, and thank you for joining us. So we've got a great panel lined up for you today. We're going to be talking about hiring and firing and sharing our stories with you, going through best practice, going through when it hasn't gone well, because actually I think that's often when you learn the most, and we'll be as open and candid as possible about all of those topics as well. Zishan's giving me a bit of a smile there. We'll kick off in about a minute. So welcome to everyone joining. This is going to be a webinar with a great panel talking about hiring and firing, a guide for founders. And this isn't us coming with a fount of all knowledge. It's more about us sharing our experiences and generally where we've got it wrong, in the hope that we all sort of learn. And Nick's the only one that's going to really come to the table with how it should be done. And then we're going to tell you how we didn't follow those rules at all. Good stuff. Great, so we're going to kick off. We do have one panelist who is MIA, so he might join us shortly, but we'll kick off with the panelists that we have today. You will know who they are from the description on the webinar link that we signed up to, but just a quick introduction. My name is Romany Thomas. I'm the founder and CEO of Juggle Jobs. We have put together this panel today because we specialize in helping companies to find the best possible people. So of course, hiring and firing is very much part of what we do, and we're in the thick of that. I myself have been involved in a number of hiring and firing decisions and through the years at Juggle and also in my previous company as well. So very happy to relay war stories. I'm going to be on the panel today, and Mia's going to be moderating. I'm going to hand over to the panelists now to do just a very, very brief intro on themselves, and also just to give us a sense of why you were interested in joining the panel today and what you are hoping to learn from your fellow panelists as well. So Nick, I'd love to start with you, please.
Thank you, and yeah, great to be here with you guys again. I'm part of Legal Edge, which is a consultancy made up of ex-in-house lawyers, and we're using our training from private practice and our experience of working in industry for the benefit of startups and small businesses as they scale up. So it's really rewarding work working with people who care about what they're doing. It's something I really, really enjoy, and particular to this panel, these sorts of issues are something that everyone has to deal with at some point, and it really sort of sits with the way that we work generally. Is the best solution for employment sort of issues is actually partnering as you go along. So for me, it's really great to hear the first-hand experience from the rest of the panel, and anyone else that wants to contribute, because this is a really vital issue, I think, that affects everyone interested in what we're doing.
Fantastic, thanks Nick. And one of the reasons that we were really interested to get Nick onto the panel today is because firing, letting people go in particular is difficult, and there's often a gap between policy and process and those types of steps and actually what works in terms of business reality and communication. And we've sort of dealt with Legal Edge a few times, and they seem to have a very pragmatic approach to things, which is just very helpful in a fast-moving market where you as the founder need to make dynamic decisions. So Nick, thanks for joining us today. Madalena, over to you.
Hi, I'm Madalena, and I'm Director of Delivery at Makers. At Makers, we empower people to change careers into becoming software engineers, and we work with tech companies to accelerate their tech revolution. The reason why I was extremely appealed to join this webinar is because I feel like even though we can go through hiring and firing cycles numerous times, it's almost like having a process is helpful, but there's no one size fits all, and therefore hearing out what other members who are participating today and also going away with sort of some of your questions and thoughts is always a growing opportunity, which I am grateful for.
Fantastic. Yes, I completely agree with you. There's some set rules and a process, but ultimately we're dealing with people, right? So we need to look at these situations on a case-by-case basis and try not to pattern match too much. I think that's a great first lesson. Zishan.
Hey, I'm Zishan. So my background, I spent the first part of my career working as a recruiter in a recruitment agency, mainly in tech. And then after 4 years of that, I moved in-house to the BBC as a tech recruiter. After 4 years there, I got promoted and became in charge of all digital and tech recruitment across the BBC. Then moved in-house to the British government, to the government digital service, and helped them transform how they did tech recruitment. And then I was approached by a Series B startup called Onfido, helped scale them from 50 people to over 250 people, over 7 global sites. They're now 500 plus and just about to IPO. And it was my role at Onfido which kind of allowed me to move not just from the recruitment to getting people in the door, but then actually the other parts of the employee life cycle as well. So kind of how to recruit people and bring them on board, but then also, as we've all said, continue that empathy, that compassion, that humanity, using processes to support those difficult conversations. But again, understanding that these are people that you have made some commitments to, and how to manage that, the difficult part of exiting or breaking up those relationships.
Understood. Thank you so much. Right, I'm going to hand over to our wonderful moderator, Mia, who heads up marketing at Juggle, and she's got some great questions lined up for us. In terms of questions, we're going to leave plenty of time for you as an audience to ask questions to the panelists at the end, so please do put those in. Mia, what are the instructions for the audience in terms of asking questions? And then we're going to leave plenty of time, is that correct?
That is correct. Please submit your questions either in the question function or in the chat function. Either is fine, and then we'll answer as many as we can on the webinar, and if not, we'll follow up with you individually and connect you to any of the panelists that you'd like to be connected to. So yeah, as Ron mentioned, I'm Mia. I look after demand gen at Juggle. Great to see so many of you on the session, and my primary role is going to be to grill these panelists, make them as uncomfortable as possible. So let's get started. The first question I want to touch on with all of you is, can you give me an example of a successful hire and a hire that perhaps didn't work out as planned, and the learnings or lessons you took from this? And I actually think, Romany, you'd be a great person to kick that one off.
Well, we hired this demand generation person at the beginning of the year. No, I'm just kidding. I'll give you an example recently of a process which I think was run very well by one of our tech leads to hire a junior software engineer. And we ended up hiring a great female engineer, and we're in sort of to week 3, I think, and it's clear that it's working out really well. Why was that process really good? I think the tech lead who ran it, it's one of his first hires, so he was particularly thorough. So he put a lot of work in at the front end, and I think, Zishan, this might resonate with you as well. He thought very carefully about which channels they were going to use, didn't make assumptions about that, really looked to see what was going to be new and interesting, and get the best ROI in terms of spend as well. So we gave him complete ownership for that. He managed the channels, he managed the advertising, he managed the kind of budget side of things. So there was sort of full ownership and management of the process as well. The other thing I think is we put quite a tight deadline in place. Not perhaps ideal for more senior hires, but certainly something like this, it was, right, we need to get this done in, I think it was 3-4 weeks. And this person needs to be up and started and onboarded with the team. So that meant when he was considering his planning, he was like, well, I need to completely focus on this. And as I think most of the panelists will talk about, momentum in the hiring process was really key there. So they're the two key things. An example of a hire that hasn't worked out, at the beginning of the year, we were doing a crowdfunding campaign, and we ended up hiring a PR specialist in-house instead of using an agency. And it all sort of started quite well because she was sort of very enthusiastic. She was very senior, had run her own agency previously and brought some good ideas to the table. But it became really clear quite quickly that the sort of attention to detail and project management required for the job just wasn't there. And then so after a few weeks, we let her go. It was a really uncomfortable process because we were in the midst of COVID. She had children, she was going through lots of other things. And I think my coach said this to me recently, it's very easy to be an arsehole. It's very easy to be like super soft and run almost like a care type company. It's actually much harder to be firm but empathetic. And I found treading that line with this particular, it was absolutely the right decision, and I think we made it in a timely way. But doing it when someone is struggling was very hard to communicate. So yeah, they're the two that spring to mind.
Thanks a lot. Some good insights there on both sides of that. Madalena and Zishan, do you have anything to add on that one?
Yeah, I guess maybe building up on Rom's point of a great hire, one of my sort of very, very early hires, to Rom's point, I did have a lot of time, but still have tried to take some lessons from it. And I built like a little bit of a process for it. And what I found was planning upfront made all the difference. And so everything from understanding what made a rock star out of this role and what were some of their personality or sort of core skills that they would come with, then making sure that I nailed the vocabulary in the JD. And I always try to get sort of both genders to look at the JD before it goes out. The other point was channels, and something that as a small organization, which we were at the time, I found made a difference is word of mouth and friends of friends, because if anybody who works in the organization knows somebody else, chances are that you'll have a better reference. Branding, and you touched on that, Rom. And then I found that the interview process was super important. So one of the things that we did that I thought worked really well was setting out the timelines for each stage of the interview, which when we're running at 1,000 miles an hour, we sometimes don't have time to do. But what I find is that I end up saving so much time, because what we did was we set up the dates and the stages, and then we moved at pace through those stages. Where's that person now? Well, they're in a multinational, and they entered as an intern, by the way, and now they're like the director of customer relations in a multinational. So I think that's a great solution result there. On a tougher one, the biggest lesson I learned was hiring fast. And how that can sometimes fall really short. And we really needed a product manager to come in. This was in my previous organization where I started as employee number 1, and we scaled it to over 100 people in over 30 countries. And we brought in a product person. We felt like we couldn't wait anymore for a product person. So we just took somebody that we thought was going to be good enough. The truth is, it ended up costing us twice as much time. We accumulated a ton of debt. And our lesson was, take as much time as you need to get the right person, and be thorough about it. Don't just give way because you think you don't have time. And that was sort of my biggest lesson on.
Yeah, to pick up the back of what Rom and Magdalena said there as well, I think it comes down to planning, and both Rom and Magdalena spoke about kind of planning the execution, the assessment, interview stages as well. But even before that, articulating. And I've built a campaign plan which really starts with articulating why is there a need. That's the first question I ask a hiring manager. Say, I need a software engineer, I need a product manager. Okay, what's broken that needs fixing? Why is there a need? What would happen without this hire? What's the risk? What have we already done internally to address this issue? Are 2 people kind of carrying the weight, or is there a mobility thing that somebody could potentially step up? Again, just a moment to reflect, is there something that we could do internally or whatever? Then actually starting to clarify the problem, the mission. In one line, what is this person's mission? What are their responsibilities going to be? And almost as a percentage breakdown, 50% of this, 40% of that, 10% of this. Even as a loose part, that's good just to get it out of your head and start articulating. How will this person contribute towards your team and or company goals, right? And then start to break that down. Once you start to articulate that, then you're starting to build in a plan of actually, here's the problem that needs solving. And then thinking through, this person joins, what's their 30, 60, 90 days? what key outcomes have they delivered in 30, 60, 90 days? And that's what leads on to, yeah, you supplement that with the profile, the industry, the targeting in terms of what markets, the referrals, the assessment process. But then once you've cleared before you've even started the campaign, after 30 days, they probably understand the infrastructure, the team members. 60 days, they've owned one problem. 90 days, they've owned and basically iterated one or two particular things in terms of process or documentation, whatever. You can start to see quite quickly whether they're on track to do that or not. You can tell them that as part of the interview process. After 30 days, say, we expected you to be here, you're not here, or you're ahead, you're where we expected you to be after 60 days, whatever. The point being is use your probation period for exactly what it is there for. A lot of people do not, because back to what Rom said, having difficult conversations, they let just probation periods lapse. And Nick will say this as well. Actually, once people are past that, then their employment rights change as well. You want to look after them, but it's all about managing expectations and essentially closing the perception gap, right? Rather than having to have a performance conversation more formally. And you can do that right from the beginning if you articulate what problem you're looking to solve and then proactively communicate that to everyone concerned.
Great, thanks a lot. A lot of useful context there. And I think a really interesting point from Madalena of how do you hire quickly and effectively, but without falling short, and also with that foresight in mind, so that balance. So I want to go to Rom on this one first, and then open it out to all of you. How do you actually know if you're hiring effectively, and how do you measure this?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a very simple one, and actually I was struggling to think about how to answer it effectively as well, which sort of goes to Zishan and Mads's points earlier about actually you need to really think deeply about why you're hiring this person and what good and impact really looks like before you get to the hiring point, because then you can map back to that. And any good candidate as well will be asking, what does good look like after 30 days, 60 days, 90 days? What does that impact need to look like? Everyone needs to be super, super clear. So I think the answer is getting very clear on the why you're hiring and what good looks like, because often that can actually change the trajectory of the hire. You think that actually you need perhaps a salesperson or a marketing person, when actually it's the product that needs fixing. I mean, that's an example, but it's worth putting in time at the beginning to really think through what the business drivers are, and then you can attach metrics and standards and so on and work backwards. And then I think it comes down to regular checking in. You know, behaviorally, it's very difficult to start micromanaging later. That's no good. So if someone joins and then you sort of say, okay, we're just going to leave you to it and off you go, and then after a month as a boss you come back and you're like, well, this isn't up to scratch, and then you're breathing down their neck, that's just not going to be a positive environment for anyone. Whereas if you sort of speak up front about the fact that you're going to be spending time and energy onboarding them, particularly for that first month or even a little bit longer, and work together on what good looks like, then it becomes easier to start letting go and going that way around. So just regular check-ins, feeding back about what's working, what's not, eating the frog, so to speak, is very important.
I love that. And yeah, eating the frog is actually one of our internal values. Madalena, anything to add? Anything to add there, and what kind of metrics do you currently use in terms of measuring how effective that process is?
That's a great question. I think first of all, in my mind, I always have the question is of, am I setting you up for success? And therefore having those personal objectives, or they can start with the 30, 90 days, later personal objectives, having them linked to OKRs, and then how I measure whether they are being successful is, there are two parts to this. And one is sort of, I'm in the right space to talk about it, and the other one may be too touchy-feely. So one of them is, are the business measures in the area where that they're influencing showing like promising signs? the other one is for the objectives that they've set, are they making a tangent in the right direction? And that's where I think one-to-ones are super important. But then the other thing is, if they are, whether it's somebody who's directly in my team or somebody who's reporting to somebody in my team or a different team, is does the person who is their manager feel relieved? And that's the touchy-feely, right? Like there's a piece of, there's the data, but then there's also a sense of, this is a great addition to the team. I've been able to hand over these 3 things, and we're seeing it move in the right direction. And so that's, a bit more of the business measures, but also some of the emotional that comes into it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense on the fact that it is that balance and bringing together that art and science. I want to go to Nick now to talk about whether or how the process differs if it's actually a C-level hire that isn't working out versus anyone else. From your perspective, what are your thoughts there, Nick?
Yeah, it's an interesting distinction and almost quite a traditional one, because we used to be, when there were far more kind of medium up to large size businesses, and there were less of us in this sort of space. It was the idea that there was an internal, maybe HR ops type management of your standard level employees, and then your C-suite, they'd sit sort of a little bit removed, and any internal troubles up there would generally be dealt with a bit differently. So, for example, performance concerns for sort of a mid-level manager might result in a formal performance improvement process that was painful for everyone involved and goes over kind of several months. Whereas the C-suite one may give the impression of actually just being done behind closed doors, a confidential chat, a suitable settlement agreement, and the guy's out the door with a pretty anodyne announcement to the rest of the team. I think these days in these sorts of businesses, things have merged to a certain extent. C-suite in a small business, obviously the impact of something not being right is incredible. So you need to move with a degree of pace, which does close the door on anything particularly formal. And if we're talking about this happening in the first 2 years of employment, then a lot of the legal considerations become a bit more straightforward. But that's not taking anything away from the complexity of the practical side. So you've got to move quickly, you've got to have frank conversations. And this is where I think these things have merged. All the stuff that the guys have been saying about the structure around the hire, and also the structure about how people are managed. And I think that goes just for the C-suite people as well, is if the role's defined and you know where the person should be and the person knows where they should be, then that constructive conversation where you move swiftly, perhaps there's a bit of negotiation, but you've got all the evidence you need to back it up. It gives you the ammo for that frank conversation. You're not having to do that move from a care organization, I love that description, to straight to something really hard, because the structure's all there. So all you're doing is having an honest conversation. So with C-suite at this sort of level, I think it's frank conversation, evidence-based, and moving as swiftly as possible to remedy what's going wrong, even if that does mean a settlement agreement and some sort of formal end to the legal relationship that's of some benefit to both parties.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Can't wait to get that big payout. Just kidding. So we had a couple of questions prior to the webinar actually from the audience talking about the impact that letting go of a senior hire can have on the wider team and the best way to manage that. And sometimes people think it's almost good not to be too transparent and to kind of dismiss it and hope that people won't talk about it, or to be particularly transparent about it to the team and have a kind of open forum. Zishan, what are your thoughts on that and the best way to manage that from your experience?
I mean, my stance on this relates to all internal comms, right? People are people and people are smart. And if you don't tell them and control the narrative, they'll work it out themselves because people are smart, or they will speak to enough people. And then you'll have like water cooler whisperers and lunch queue type chats, whatever. So I always say with most of our projects at the People Collective start with solving proactive communication issues, right? So proactive communication is where you prevent problems instead of having to fix them. You answer questions before they're asked, and then you deal with complaints before they're made. In that premise, with the point about, well, what do you say? Just say, hey, we had this conversation with Zishan, it didn't work out, we had the intentions, he was going to come in and own X, Y, and Z, and it didn't work out. And how much more depth and detail you can go into it is up to you. It didn't work out. So we've left on good terms, and actually here's what we're going to do as the next plan. In the interim, Madalena is going to step up and cover. We're going to kick off a campaign, and we're going to look for somebody else. We're going to take the lessons of why it didn't work and kind of pivot in terms of the person we're looking for, or what, articulating the problem we're looking to solve. And that's what that looks like. So here's what to expect. Here's the timelines and managing expectations. Not everything has to be done using a forum. You can control the narrative quite succinctly. And basically say, if we want to have any questions, let's pick it up offline as well. And then actually, if there's enough people asking the same question, follow up at your next all hands or a next announcement, whatever, and just say, just to follow up on that, a few people came up with that question, whatever. Again, controlling the narrative, being proactive with your communication. And that's the same with any message that needs to be relayed, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really useful. And I think you've touched on something important there, in that when you let somebody go, on the one hand, there's kind of the more emotional aspect of it, and then on the other hand, it's the operational and the actual handover and that being thought through. Rom, what are your thoughts here in terms of what has and hasn't worked, perhaps, with that communication in the past?
Yeah, I think that's a really good distinction to make, because a lot of the leaders on the call will be running small growing businesses where their employees are giving 110%, and it feels like a very tight-knit community, and as a founder or CEO you can almost feel a little bit let down, even if it's your decision to have let someone go, because the pressures of running the business, and you hired that person on good faith and they didn't perform or weren't a good culture fit. I think it's very important to go through a personal process as that leader, to process that emotion first before articulating a lot of this to the team. And I've made a mistake of this in the past by being too open, but actually I realized I wasn't being super transparent. I wasn't being really open. I was just airing my feelings, and that's not an appropriate business line to take. If you're feeling let down or annoyed or angry about something, that is unfortunately part and parcel of the burden of being the CEO and the founder. And I'm sure you'll have a lot of peers that you can just go and let off steam about that particular issue. And then really what you want to need to address is the factual points that person hasn't ended up being a fit for the business, whether it's a culture fit or performance issue. I've generally found that being reasonably specific is quite important, because I think, to Zishan's point, otherwise people tend to write their own narrative. The other thing is, most people know internally, like if you have spotted that there's a performance issue or a cultural issue, chances are that the team members on the ground have spotted it as well. So talking, again, it's a difficult line to tread, though, because you're apportioning, you're sort of apportioning accountability, but you don't want to apportion blame and be super negative as well. So just articulating that conversation as professionally as possible is very important.
Can I just add on to what Rom is saying?
Sure.
There, actually, there's two bits. One is often you find there's leaders or people that, even when I recruited people, and then there's a cognitive dissonance, and in old school HR, people used to be like regretted leaver, non-regretted leaver, whatever. And it's like, oh, it's non-regretted. Actually, well, because they were looking somewhere else, they weren't committed to the cause, all of that nonsense. Actually, anyone that you've recruited, you want to retain them. If they've left under their own volition, you have to look at yourself as a business and as a leader and a leadership team. Why have they looked elsewhere? What were they not getting anymore here that led to them leave? If that opportunity didn't exist, then that's fine. But actually, if you're going to go and find out a replacement, then actually you've lost somebody there. Also, just as Ron was saying there, actually sharing feelings and that emotional side to it again goes back to kind of almost blast radius. If somebody's leaving and everyone finds out at the same time, actually, well, if that's my manager or my peer, or actually what does that mean for me in terms of that's my peer, does that mean I'm going to have more work, whatever? Before you do a company-wide announcement, think about who is this person leaving going to actually have a direct impact in, and have conversations with them beforehand. Let them know, hey, this is what's happening, here's what our plan is, here's what's going to happen for you, here's the support we're going to give around you and your team, interim manager, person coming in to support, whatever that might look like, and we're going to announce it to the whole of the company on Tuesday as well. Again, just that little touch of being proactive and considerate to people around the person and the person themselves makes such a difference. And often it's thing that's overlooked rather from leaders as well. Hey, we need to be equitable and tell everyone at the same time. Again, proactive communication means having some empathy and compassion about the message you say and when you say it, and more importantly, how you say it to that person as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of important points here. I want to move on a related topic, but a little bit tangential to Madalena, because I know you had to oversee a reduction in the team in the past, which is slightly different and often, yeah, on a much broader scale. So what did you find to be the most challenging aspect of this, and what advice would you give to other founders and leaders who unfortunately might need to go through the same at some point?
So firstly, I think it's worth saying that it's never easy, because, you know, it's people we're talking about. But again, as has been pointed out, trying to take a step back and being objective about the situation. In our case, what we did is we knew we wanted to be very sort of people-centric, which we are, a very people-centric business. We wanted to have people at the center. And again, we wanted to plan as much as we could up front. So what we did was we had two options, whether to go through like a formal consultation process or not. We went through a consultation process where we drafted out all of our conversations up front, and we sought legal advice for it in order to make sure that all of our T's were crossed and our I's were dotted. Then what we did is, again, we didn't have to, but we chose to go through a first one-to-one with every team member, every single team member in the organization, affected or not affected. And then we also had a second session. We didn't have to have two sessions, but we wanted to use the first session to get their feedback. And in some cases, we had people who said, I don't agree with this, and they came back with good arguments, and we were genuinely interested, and we had agreed this up front, that we'd be genuinely interested in hearing their arguments, because sometimes we don't have all of the perspectives, and when we do gather everything, we can build a better picture. So then we made sure that we were transparent throughout the whole process. First consultation, second consultation. We made sure that we were sort of sensitive when we asked people, you know, to keep their points to themselves, but that we would be communicating to everybody. We shared the whole comms plan throughout the whole week in which this took place. And then we documented everything. Again, I'm sure Nick will be able to add some points around why that is, but having everything in paper trail in general, anything related to people, having it in paper trail is a good idea. And then for those people who we sadly had to furlough or let go, we made sure that we were as generous as we could absolutely be. And that's because, again, like during difficult times, it's change. It's like it's people's lives who are being affected, and you know they'll definitely go on to other roles and other things, but it in a way it helps to mitigate some of maybe their fears or their anxiety around the situation. What we also did was after our sort of couple of all hands, we made sure that with managers we set up FAQs that people, or Q&As that people could join. And to Zishan's point, what we tried in those all hands was we almost like drafted, or we definitely drafted our own FAQs, like what would the FAQs be, and tried to answer those FAQs in the all hands. But we still kept the Q&As because there are always questions that don't come up, and like, how is it going to impact me? What happens next? And we had communicated all of that plan, but still people want to talk about it and they want to let out some steam. So that's how we ran through the process. And you know, we had people coming back saying thank you. We've come through to better times. We've hired some of those back again. So like there's lots that goes into it, and it's never an easy journey, but doing it with heart and also objectivity, we found was a humane thing to do, but also the right thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really good takeaway, that often a little goes a long way. So offering somebody a little bit more than what is discretionary can have a really positive impact. So I'm going to dive into a few specifics with Nick just around that paper trail and a couple of other things. Before I do that, I just want to talk to you a little bit about the hiring plan and aligning that to business objectives. So we've talked a bit about a 30-60-90 and some of these processes. I know a lot of people on the call don't have a huge amount of resource in terms of team, time, or capacity. And often the founders we're speaking to, they get a round of funding, they know they need to hire, they suddenly have hundreds of thousands of pounds of revenue to hit. So they actually do need to hire very quickly. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on distilling it into kind of 2 or 3 really simple steps that a founder can take there. Because I know some of the more really structured processes could be a little bit overwhelming. Zishan, you're nodding. Do you want to take the lead on that one?
This is often the challenge that we see at the People Collective, where a founder says, hey, I need to scale. And we're like, okay, great, talk to us about it. So we're like, oh, okay, our revenue is 1 million, let's say, and we need to 3x our revenue to 3 million. And we're 20 people. So we're going to, let me just do the math, 3x my headcount. So we're going to hire 60 people by the end of the year. And that's just like, is that how you're wanting to scale the organization? Surely there should be some compounding element there to it. And so what we often find, long story short, you've got a business plan, and then you come up with some sort of hire plan by doing that loose equation. But there's no org design element in the middle, where you look at your business processes, your workflows, your roles and responsibilities, the volumes of work that are coming in, the activity analysis of who's doing what, and looking at those resources. People aren't resources, but the resources that those people have access to. And it's almost putting together the blueprint. And then we then take them through and just go, okay, well, let's look at it almost like gold, silver, bronze. Actually, bronze is the absolute minimum you need to go from now to the next phase of your growth. However, if you overperform, right, and so if you achieve that, what's the minimum amount of people that you need to do that particular thing, right? Okay, we need 4, these essential 4 hires, right? If you then overperform that slightly, and actually the revenue you hit is slightly more, could you afford to then bring some other people in dependent on that? Yeah, okay, that's your silver plan. What happens if you do all the targets and actually then you meet all your objectives? Okay, that's the gold plan, right? So it's then dissecting, you know, as we said before, each of those roles into a qualification, but then you've done all of the roles as a hire plan, as a gold, silver, bronze. That's your blueprint for hiring. You can talk to everybody in the business about it. As you hire a head of sales, here's what we think you need as a head of sales. Give them the opportunity to give their stance on it. You've hired a product lead, a head of talent, whatever. What do they think about these things? And again, it's looking at it almost like a product roadmap. What's the MVP, and what are the features that actually, if this, then that, we scale into? And that's often the thing that people go, I didn't think about that. For me, it's obvious because I know and understand it intimately, right? But when we talk to founders and leadership teams about this, they're like, oh, we think about this, about the product and about our market fit and opportunity. We don't think about strategically about our business and growth plans off the back from there. That's a lot of me talking, so I'll shut up, but it's one of the most common pain points that we go in and start helping companies with.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. Ron, any thoughts to add when founders are in that almost panicked frenzy of knowing that they need to achieve the growth, knowing that they need to hire, but yeah, just to kind of take a step back and take a deep breath, I guess.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, because I think too, I think one of Madalena's points earlier, you can actually waste a lot of time by moving too quickly. I think of this in a 3P framework, and let me just break this down. So the first is planning, even though it's counterintuitive, and I think this point's been reiterated. The planning up front, I think probably like any business decision, saves you so much time later down the line. So that's the first P. The second is psychologically gearing yourself up for a degree of pain. Hiring is actually painful. We are trying to make it a lot easier. So Sean's trying to make it a lot easier, but it's painful, right? People are unpredictable. competitive landscape of finding talented people in the tech market is just like super painful. And I think just psychologically accepting a degree of that is quite important. A little bit like when you're fundraising, just accept there's going to be a high degree of pain there. And the last is thinking about pace. We've talked about momentum and making that better. And I'll use the analogy of sprinting. You want to really be pacing at about the 400-meter sprint, which is like the very peak of anaerobic fitness at the professional level, where it's, you know, you've run a really thorough and a really taxing race, but you're still in that kind of anaerobic mode, that performance mode. Once you get over that, then you're into long distance territory, and trust me, that's when you start to lose the will, and then the pain side goes up a lot more. So planning, pain, and pace, the 3 Ps.
That's great.
Could I
love
add
that
a couple of
analogy.
Ps onto that? Actually,
Yeah, go
because
for it.
Go ahead.
whilst we've been speaking about planning the whole time, we know what it's like working in a startup and a scale up. You have to pivot, right, based on all these other factors as well. But the thinking about that is actually, once you know why you're pivoting and what your plan was, actually you can be pragmatic about what you need to change, but you know why you're changing, because you know what other influences. Say, oh, we said we were going to recruit 5 product managers in this location. We don't need that, and that was part of the plan because of this reason. And then you can proactively communicate that to your internal teams, to your market, whatever it might be. So adding to Rom's P's, pragmatism, pivoting, proactive communication to that initial planning, pain, and psychological kind of approach as well. So all the P's.
I see a P collaboration in our future.
Perfect.
Amazing. I'm not surprised Romy used that analogy, because she's a fitness fanatic and she's 8 months pregnant and still doing weights. So I hope that'll make all of you feel as bad as it makes me. I want to turn to Nick now for perhaps a couple of the meatier topics, which I think the feedback we've got prior to this webinar, nobody really discusses, and people are really quick to talk about processes and the successes, but yeah, nobody is as transparent as when it goes wrong, and some of that obviously spans kind of the legal side of things. So just to kick off, Nick, from your experience, what are the do's and don'ts in terms of not leaving yourself open to discriminatory action?
Brilliant. And I'm still reeling from the 400-meter analogy, which I love. You know, the founders, you'll be the superstars on the track. I'm probably in that scenario, some boring guy with a clipboard. But anyway, the P that I'm adding is clearly protect. So we'll work with that. I think just to split my comments into sort of 2 sections. One is if the relevant employee that you're talking about in where things are coming to a natural close for you is over 2 years, then the planning side becomes even more important. You must seek advice. If you've got in-house counsel, talk to them, get them involved in the planning early. A lot of those discussions that you have and correspondence, if you've got internal or external, a legal advisor, will be protected. So you can be frank. And my plea is to, you know, to get them involved early, because it's essential to navigate your way through that roadmap. Under 2 years service, which is what sort of on topic, then the same planning thing applies as far as possible. Discrimination basically is a very technical way of an employee bypassing the need to have 2 years service to access the large body of UK employment rights. So you still need to be aware of circumstances that could lead to that sort of claim being brought through. And that also covers things like whistleblowing, which is a very technical topic, but essentially comes down to if someone has, you know, feels they're being victimized for making a complaint about something the company is doing, then it's, you know, it's not a fire at will type situation, sort of like you think sort of either apprentice style or in the US. So always do plan, and I think planning will then help with the don'ts, which the biggest one for this sort of scenario and the 2 years is don't avoid the truth for the reason why someone is going. And it echoes what's been said before. If you duck the difficult conversation, then in a under 2 years termination, and if you don't sort of explore those topics, why it hasn't worked out, what you're doing is legally leaving a vacuum for the reason for dismissal, that someone who, if they're maybe recalling alternative facts after the event, can imply either it was the result of some sort of victimization, it was to do with actually discrimination, because they're the only person of their particular race or sex that this treatment applied to. And suddenly, as the employer, you're on the back foot and having to kind of counter that suddenly, and that would probably be bringing through all the performance stuff that you were on top of, but it's after the fact already. Whereas if you're up front with that, I think, as you said, in a respectful way, you can still have that hard and honest and painful conversation. But getting it out honestly at that point, even if you haven't done it before then, which obviously is also recommended, do it at that point, because it will protect you from potential claims afterwards. And by potential claims, I don't mean they're going to be successful, but they are a massive leech of energy and time, and they're a source of stress, even if their prospects of success is really, really slim. So yeah, that's my big watch out there.
Yeah, perfect. Good.
Nick, as well, just understanding the local employment laws as well, because yes, you might have offices in different locations and regions, and understanding that more and more companies are opening themselves to being fully remote, and understanding your protecting yourself, as Nick was saying, understand what's your responsibility and how does it work in that premise. A lot of companies it's great opening up the world to remote talent, but then reading the fine print of actually, well, what does that mean further down the line, definitely is worth considering as well.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I'm just going to move, sorry, we've got so many questions pouring in from the audience, and I have one final question for Nick from, that was also a popular request. When it comes to performance reviews, what is the requirement legally and what is that company discretion?
I mean, there's nothing set out in I'll just check my big book of law. There's nothing set out there that says you've got to do performance reviews in any sort of particular sense that way. But where it does hit is when you're looking at that body of UK employment law on termination. So if you've got someone over 2 years and you're looking at sort of performance, presumably with this, were they given a chance? Were they aware that they were underperforming? Were they made aware of the performance gap? Did you support them in the training? And there's this sort of checklist of questions that have evolved through the case law over the years that will, worst case, which we would not want no one to be near, an employment tribunal judge would be assessing to see if we're there. So it all comes back from that, really. So legally, it would probably, at this level, for a startup company, it would translate itself into practical steps and the processes which the expert panel have already set out. It's being honest, and I think for me the biggest thing I see clients I try and help them with is the realization that performance management doesn't mean something's already gone wrong. It has to be a continuous, ongoing, honest, two-way conversation, and if you're doing that, then you're going to avoid a lot of problems down the line, and you might not even need then sort of the legal advice stepping in. I think anything 30, 60, 90 onwards, keep that going. You can structure it however you wish, annually, quarterly, whatever, but just as long as the employee, you think ask yourself honestly, does this employer I'm getting frustrated with, do they know actually where they should be and what's going wrong?
Perfect. Thank you, Nick. Super helpful. Okay, I'm going to try and get through as many of these questions as I can. Thanks for all the questions pouring in. And I just asked the panelists to try to keep the answers to these a little bit succinct so we can get through as many as possible. The first one I think I can direct to Romany. Hi, in your experience, how do you best handle taking references? I tried to do these verbally, but are there any tips, top tips and flags to watch out for?
Yeah, that's a great question, because referencing in its current form isn't that fit for purpose at the moment. There are some founders that are doing it really well. There are basically, I think there's sort of 3 stages to the vetting, the kind of referencing process. One is checking someone's identity and they are who they say they are. It sounds a bit tick boxy, but it's definitely worth doing it. And there's companies like Verimark and Onfido, who Zashan worked for, who can do that. You'd be surprised, you do actually get caught out by people who aren't that legit. The second is what I call backdoor references, where you sort of evaluate your own network, see where that person has worked, and do your own due diligence. Not unlike you would do with a VC, for example, where you would, yes, they will present you with references of founders who are all sparkly and on their website, but actually you then want to speak to the founders who they screwed over as well. That can be a really delicate conversation to have, because if that person's in role, if you have that conversation too early, you're completely screwing them over. So I'd recommend you have those conversations only if you know those people are super trusted, and there's going to be no recourse. And if there's any doubt that that might go back onto that person, then just don't have the conversation at all. And then the third, of course, is to ask the candidate for references. There's a school of thought to say do it after the offer. I think that's a bit pointless, but hopefully you will be close to a decision, and then the reference and conversation is more about understanding this kind of person and how they handle things. We've actually got a resource about how to take references with some example questions, which we can share after the webinar with you to give you some specific points. But a really good question that I've heard asked is this person in the top 10% of people you've ever worked with? It's quite a direct question, and they sort of need to answer yes or no, and then you can follow up with that with are they in the top 5%? It's not necessarily going to sway your decision on whether to hire them or not, but it certainly gives you a very direct answer on the quality of that person straight away.
Yeah, absolutely. Some really good thoughts there, and we can definitely follow up with that resource. I'm going to move on to the next one, which I'll just open to the floor. In an early stage company, particularly in the first 5 years, how do you live by the hire slowly maxim, but also get a candidate that is the right cultural fit or cultural add, particularly when it's a senior role?
If I could take that, start with a plan, know what you're hiring for, everything that we said previously. Culture fit is a huge one. It's almost your face doesn't fit, but we're not going to give you an objective reason as to why. Your coding skills, your product, your sales skills. So when I was building this out, it was like, well, what is culture fit for us? You've got the slogans, culture is what people do when you're not looking or without being told what to do, etc. I broke down our culture to 3 things: values, behaviors, and attitude, right? Values, companies, startups build. And then what we started to document are values are belief systems, things that you believe in, and behaviors are how you manifest those beliefs, and your attitude is how you go about doing that on a day-to-day basis. So what we started to document was our value is around kind of succeeding together. Here are some behavioral examples of how we do it. In an interview, we say, give us some examples of when you succeeded with other people, right? So you're using questions to document and being objective of, is that the person, is that behavior aligned to the values of how we do it? Now talk us through your attitude about how you did it. Was it I, we, whatever? That, because I was having to go back to candidates and say, we're not going to hire you, excuse me, because you're not the right culture fit. And even before having that conversation, I was just like, I can't go to somebody and say that because it means nothing. So I'd go back to our hiring teams and managers and be like, we need to work out what that actually means. And so that's where you take away the bias, all of that unconscious bias and those issues around culture fit. Again, starts with planning, documentation, interview training, and then going from there, really. Easy.
Just a really quick thing to add to that, if I can, is
Please do.
if you haven't sorted out what your culture means and you're using lack of cultural fit as a reason to reject someone, you are steaming headfirst into potential discrimination territory, or at least inference of. So yeah, totally echo as you said there.
Rightly so as well.
Great point to add, Nick. I'm gonna go to Madalena on this one. How do you establish the right forum for when it might not be particularly obvious to the manager or hiring manager that a certain hire isn't working out, but it's having a big impact on the team? So how do you establish the right channel of communication? Because I guess some people would be concerned that could be unprofessional, or it just looks like you're complaining about a peer. So yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
So just to clarify, you're asking me is, who am I in this organization?
You can be any of the parties. Just in your experience, what's the right way to communicate and establish the right channels for communication if it's not obvious to the person who hired an individual or is managing an individual that they perhaps aren't working out?
That's a good question. So with any of the managers, I think, first of all, it's important to have a strong rapport. And secondly, if the personal objectives have been set up, or the 30, 60, 90 days, and walking through with the manager in terms of, hey, I'd love to have a catch up regarding X, would love to see how they're progressing in their probation period. Can you run me through, what you've set up and how they're performing against it? So I think that is a foundation, but I think it also means that it's important to have good relationships with your team members, and when it doesn't always fall. So we have very sort of transparent culture, but equally it's transparent both ways. So if somebody may come to me like, no, they're great, they're excellent, then what I typically do is I set up a series of more regular meetings that I may usually have with that manager to do regular check-ins. And I encourage them to do the same thing with their team member, because if they're not succeeding, I think there's also a question as to why not, right? And to the point of, am I setting them up for success? Have we given them all the tools? Have they been onboarded as per our standard? Has something happened in their lives? Maybe something's happened in their lives that we don't know about. So I think setting up that regular cadence, looking at their objectives, but also sort of digging deeper and asking those questions over time. Or what I find generally is that the manager then tends to sort of come into themselves if the data starts stacking up. And those are sort of my 2 cents on that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think, yeah, sometimes you might have to have conversations beyond just you and that person to see how well they're transitioning, or how well they're progressing in the role, because sometimes it's not as visible. So one final question, which is kind of a big one, I guess. So there's some thoughts here from a couple of people saying that they can't actually afford to get a senior hire wrong. So when you're moving really rapidly, when it can often take 3 months to get that person onboarded because of notice periods and etc., how do you hire, really mitigating the risk for firing? So I'm going to ask each of you just to give kind of one thought on that, hiring so you don't have to fire, to finish up on.
I'm happy to kick this one off, and I promise I'm not intentionally trying to advertise what we do, but I do actually think it's one of the hidden solutions. It's actually one of the hidden whys as to why companies use us, in that you have to use a lot of political capital as a CEO to hire a C-suite person, and getting it wrong can be really painful. We specialize in placing people on at the C-suite and the senior levels on a flexible basis. And there's a degree of then assessing fit in this slightly more casual way, where you can assess whether someone's a good culture fit and they're actually having impact on the business as I said, in a more casual way, and then they can convert to a permanent employee down the line without removing too much political capital from you as a leader. And so it works in favor of the moving fast aspect as well, because you can hire people who are immediately available. Yeah, so come to juggle jobs is my response to that one.
Amazing. Madalena, Zishan, Nick, just a couple of words, couple of thoughts.
So just a quick thought on my end is, I often think about I know what it's called, a triangle, which is time, cost, and quality. And if you can't afford to get quality wrong, then you gotta give on time or cost. And to that note, no promos here, but I do find that working with Juggle, for example, it's kind of like getting a pre-vetting. The time that I don't have initially, there's somebody else who's doing the vetting and doing the initial process just as diligently as I would. And so I find it really helpful to work with Juggle or similar.
Yeah, to supplement that would be, do the plan, execute that, follow that process, but then also just over communicate with everybody involved in the situation, particularly the candidate, and then as they become the employee, manage expectations, close the perception gap, and you'll be in a better chance of not having to fire them because the perception of what's wanted and needed continues to be disparate.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Nick?
Similar topic. It's know what you want, and you're not expecting the C-suite hire to come in and you want them to have an impact on culture that will increase down the line, but they're not coming in to drastically change the way your business is being done at that particular point. If that's what you're after, then you're probably looking in the wrong place, and there's other things that need sorting. So know who you are as a founder and CEO, and what the company really wants, and you're immediately closing that perception gap even before you're having conversations there.
Great note to end on. Thank you, everyone. I know we're a couple of minutes over, so I'll wrap up there. Thank you to all our wonderful panelists and to the audience for joining, and we will follow up with the materials and contact details. Have a great
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.